an overarching theme with both so-called Marxists and so-called Jungians, or at least you can't really put all Jungians into the same basket with this, but there's a large contingent of Jungians who essentially are politically aligned to these neo-Marxist identitarian sort of crowd. Um, but at least analogously, you can see intellectual themes that relate to what I'm about to say about, let's say, a real interpretation of sort of facts on the ground, which can be used as an analogy. Is that these, effectively what these so-called Marxists are trying to do is they're trying to help the plutocracy abolish the middle class. And they're doing this in two ways, essentially. They're creating a creed, an ideology around irresponsibility that is codependent with a kind of paternalistic system which caters to and panders to its subjects, sort of in response to the fealty and allegiance and the groupthink, sort of that corresponds with that. And this is, and as they abolish the middle class, which is not just for that reason of kind of infecting people with that ideology of irresponsibility, of the idea that the individual can actually manifest responsibility and sort of chart their own course. Because essentially in the neo-Marxist sort of paradigm, they expect businesses, they expect each institution, each entity to take responsibility for correcting history. And as they are meant to play their role in saving people from sort of the consequences of history, they are expected to gerrymander things in order to correct history. So instead of correcting the problem at the point at which it manifests, there's this whole kind of corrective ideological program which everyone has to sort of use to filter their thinking, and they have to use that framework of interpretation to adjust. So they adjust everyone's identity according to their designation, according to the historical narrative. And so this is the groupthink. This is the kind of the fascistic lens as well. The totalitarian, get on board, or go to the gulag, or the gas chamber. Although although it's more fascistic than it was Leninistic in some sense, because it does require a scapegoat. It does require something like a Jewish conspiracy, the conspiracy of white male privilege, for instance. And so without that scapegoat to hang it all on, you can't really stabilize it, because then the identities would automatically be antagonistic and abrasive to each other. They are still antagonistic and abrasive to one another, but in as much as that they can coalesce around creating some kind of extractive mechanism, in which there can be a unifying ideological, it's what bands them together, as it were, that they all have the same target of complaint. And without that notion, they don't have any cohesion between them. And they already don't, because, they are already imagining the freedom that was, counterfactually robbed from them. It's all based on a historical counterfactual that if the exploitation and the oppression didn't happen, we would be in this ulterior position, and so we can just project that ulterior position, and that is the means to the end. And they want businesses, and they want all institutions and all entities to take on that role of enforcing that counterfactual historical advent, and which is sort of imposed, and everyone must just be on the same page with that. And at the same time, you lose contact with any kind of interpersonal reality, with any kind of individual responsibility. Is just completely dispersed into the system narrative. So there's no accountability, and in fact, people only have accountability for holding up the ideological narrative. Now, obviously, this is anathema to actually a labour market that has any kind of meritocratic common sense of commonality and values and universalism, or so all notions of that just get put into this blender of the sausage machine of this identitarian slant and skewing of everything. And everyone has to believe how you adjust those things in just the right way, and that has to become a dogmatic orthodoxy which is invasively imposed on people, that you must look at the world, you must judge the world not from your own experience but from this ideological platform that is this unifying groupthink, this totalitarian monstrosity. And the idea in that monolith, the idea in sort of the subjection of this tower, this ideological Tower of Babel, that is all they have essentially. Yeah. Okay. So I was just wanting to bring out the point that as they influence policy, as these neo-Marxists get into corrupting standards, which in America it's just usually been for colleges, and now I guess it's in business as well. In South Africa, it's probably at the worst sort of point of racialist quotas and things like that, which are so dehumanizing. It forces everyone into being a racialist token, and not only is it bad on a psychosocial level, but it's completely corrosive on just a practical level, because essentially it creates such a perverse incentive that if you actually give experience to black professionals, or if you school them through their work experience from having no credentials before then, they just get headhunted. So essentially it keeps small businesses completely anemic, because there's this premium on black labor, essentially on black professional labor or competent black professionals, and it's so toxic. It's so incredibly toxic. It's just destroyed civil society in many ways that are incalculable. It's destroyed a non-racialist consciousness. It's actually promulgates a racialist consciousness, which is very much. It's almost like a. It's very similar in ways to the apartheid way of thinking, because if you want to be on the side of the policy that does this kind of horrible tokenism that it projects onto people. Yeah, many black professionals that are actually competent, they don't put up with this. They just leave the country. So this is why you can often find very excellent black professionals working in London, working all over the world, just not in South Africa, because it's just it's just a sabotaged economy effectively. The ethos is wrong, and plus and because we therefore don't have a vibrant entrepreneurial a third leg of the economy, the small and medium business leg of the economy is effectively gutted. Yes, there are people that can make it work in some industries and some circumstances, but it's just too constraining, it's too mentally taxing, and it's too practically inconvenient, essentially, that it can't really be coped with. I mean, for most people. There are some people, as I said, that can make it work, but I mean, it's in a general way, I mean, it's devastating, and it has devastated the economy, and it's also arrested the development and transformation of the economy, which therefore then gives them an excuse to make even more centralizing demands in which the government can control more resources, even though it's so corrupt, and even though it has so much plundering and stealing, essentially, in the name of essentially elevating the black identity and the black pride. So it's this sort of, this ethos of black pride has effectively bankrupted us, because the idea is that when pride is equal and statistically distributed, which can be seen by the even number, so then we will have reached parity or something like that. So the only way that you can do that is by essentially giving power to centrally top-down figures of institutional significance, and so you get sort of the rule of man. You get the displacement of the rule of law. You just get sort of licenses handed out and tenders handed out, and more resources controlled by people using these these standards and these measures, which have nothing to do with a meritocracy. It's just based on tokenism. And so everything is due to tokenism. Everything's cause because of the ideological solution. The reasoning for everything must be disruptive because it's based on identity and not based on actually the facts on the ground. And this is why they don't actually solve the problem, because they're not dealing with the problem. They're just trying to equalize effects and consequences or something like that. They're like, well, if we end up with people in the same situation. I mean, there's so many legal concepts that would very easily show how hollow and vacuous and intellectually destitute this whole system is. I mean, it's basically a system of collective punishment, which is a war crime. Um, uh, it's also a system that you know, you have to understand that when someone has a claim in law for satisfaction for non-patrimonial damages, um, which is the kind of claim that this sort of identity grievance culminates in people, that they have lost some of their immaterial estate in the loss of pride in their identity. You cannot you cannot be paid as a group. You cannot be given something as a group. It just doesn't work. You can only be given something as an individual, and then you have to make an individual claim. And this is, the problem with this is that it's not quantifiable. It's an unknown quantity, and this is what the ideology essentially uses to fuel its corruption, because the political leaders and their mouthpieces, is that essentially they can use that unknown quantity effectively to abuse the system, abuse the ideological machinery that they have, because they never take responsibility, they never take accountability for their failed policy, because it's never their fault. They can just continue to say, well, it's the situation that history has left us in. And this is the thing, is that the more of an abject failure the ideological solution is, the more valid its narrative and its ideological machinery the more pertinent it makes itself. So it is in the form of a false prophet. It makes promises, it doesn't keep the promises, which prove that it needs to be regarded as more correct by people. So its argument grows stronger as its effects grow weaker. And so it gets more and more rabid and hysterical, and you can see this in their rhetoric and in their sophistry and in their rhetoric. It's because it's based on tautological bullshit. So the more that these people actually have control of policy, the more that you can only have big players in anything. Because you can't have people that, as I say, to put it short, they're abolishing the middle class. And even if at the end of the day they say, okay, well, we're also going to eventually abolish these big companies or something like that, which I'm not actually sure, because I think that generally they would go into collusions. Whatever political figurehead actually manifested, they would actually go, it would become more like a fascistic compromise, in the same way that the National Socialism of the Nazis essentially politically gave edicts essentially to the market, and it was which is in some way it's on the level of economic exploitation. It doesn't fulfill all the promises, but at least they can sort of, in a broad way, they can shape the economy as they wish through executive command. Because if the businesses don't follow them, then they just, they've contravened the law, because everything they command they just do through changing the law, and then they jail them if they don't live up to those things. But anyway, the point is that where all the unconsciousness in these ideological machinations, it ends up in this, essentially, this creed and this cult of irresponsibility, and the necessity of some kind of paternalism that the system must inculcate within itself in order to pander to the unaccountability of its citizenry and of its sort of its abject puerile it's interesting, and all the pseudo intellectuals think that they will have a kind of a system within the hierarchy of that they'll be part of designing the structure of how to dispense this paternalism, and that the coherence of this, and you see this in the kind of pseudo intellectualism of Russell Brand, For instance, I think he's very much in the same vein of these identitarian scumbags. Uh, and they're everywhere. And they think that perhaps their caravan, their bandwagon, is going to be at the head of the procession of they're all moving in the same direction. All these sort of, because they follow the same formula, um, the same false tautological sorry, just to generalize, they follow the same idea that this Tower of Babel, uh, this some formulaic semantic construction has its piece to play in the foundation of that tower. Um, of a worldly mediator uh, that assigns and assents to the roles that are in balance according to its I mean, the problem is as well is that this only works as you have material from the deconstruction that this is based on criticizing. And so once you run out of the material of what you're criticizing, then you actually have to say, well, okay, how do we create this stuff? And then at the point at which responsibility has to be taken, rather than that being dispersed into the narrative and deferred onto the ideological enemy, it's like, sadly, they only realize this once they can envision that, they actually take over. Then someone has to take accountability and responsibility. And if they don't have, let's say, a group of people essentially to blame as a group and exploit essentially for their ideological adversarial property to their vision, they don't have any way to define progress, because they don't have a positive construction of value in their own system. They only have the idea that freedom has been stolen from them. But without the thief, they can't continue to define progress. Jordan Peterson has pointed this out, but I mean, they essentially don't care because they're too hypnotized by the historical narrative and mythology, essentially, that they peddle. So much so that they can't even see what they're doing on the ground and the kinds of the effects of their thinking and their ideology, and just the hysterical nonsense that it contains, and the blatant fascistic consequences and the fascistic form of government that it implies and invokes. Uh, And if you study the actual history of Nazi Germany as it was turning from Weimar Germany into Nazi Germany, you, you quite clearly see this, because there's always this way in which the leadership itself is not necessarily the representation of the ideology. They're only the representation of the ideology if they succeed, otherwise they just weren't doing it right. And that existed also in the early days of Nazi Germany. Maybe if Hitler fails, maybe he wasn't actually the Führer. Maybe there was another, or maybe there would be another. It's essentially contingent on being able to actually prove that their promise is true. And if they don't prove that their promise is true, it means that they were corrupt. They didn't have the right intentionality, or they didn't have the right support. People weren't respectful enough of the Führer principle, that the people didn't deserve the Führer, or the Führer wasn't actually the true Führer. And so, we see the compost of all of these rotten things that are ready to grow, and they already have grown in some form in many of these ideological camps, which are uh, quite ironic. Looking at their own rhetoric, it just shows you, how pernicious this ideology is, that it can clothe itself and be within the shell of many guises. Oh, okay. This is a slight tangent, but it related to things that I was ranting on about female and male sort of relations and roles within culture and society. I just wanted to say that I did also make a suggestion like 3 recordings ago that I sort of said it as part of a rant or whatever, that women were more in tune, let's say, with the kind of the sentimentality that comes with the kind of with the evolutionary thrust, because of also the different selective pressures that have been applied to women than to men. Men are almost naturally more malleable to the culture, whereas women are more uh, pristine in the sense that they have not had to. Well, their role has been more consistent. Um, but I think that this also has to do with when I was talking about the generation of cultures that facilitate borderline personality disordered values, which again help women essentially with their hypergamous sexual selection strategies. That and how they invent them in each generation, because it's sort of they're given the right amount of space and wide enough berth essentially in order to make them their own and to discover and even pursue them, um, pursue those strategies which they aren't berated essentially out of, and in fact they're bullied into conforming to, which is between women essentially. And their reluctance is essentially to take individual responsibility and lose the power that they get as a female bloc, by essentially coordinating their behavior and their expectations, because then as a cultural bloc, those expectations can have real structural impact on the entire and force men to comply with them essentially as well. So sort of trying to negotiate that between women themselves. You can take feminism as just being the latest example of women abrogating their uh, the role that has always been open to them, which is, like interface with culture like a man does independently, and give up the extra powers that you have. And if you want to have those extra powers, then you have to put up with the conformity that is involved in creating a block of expectations, which create a kind of cultural catalytic sort of edifice of puppet strings and such. But anyway, what I was going to say is that all the things that I just kind of described can also be imprinted on generally the kinds of borderline personality disordered strategies themselves, because borderline personality requires the use of ideology, it requires generalizations, it requires stereotype thinking in order to create an image system of an ethical system. So it displaces ethics with images so that it can hide its bad intentionality within the good intentions of the image that it was aiming for. So essentially, by simplifying life in this way, it allows them to conceal their bad intention of actually crossing the line or skirting the line, and so they can sort of feign ignorance. They can feign, oh no, I'm too simple, I don't understand. So that's why I did this horrendous thing, because I thought I was actually doing the right thing, from my little subjective point of view. So this kind of the sympathy for the oversimplified thing that was never corrected or never challenged or never developed or never matured intellectually, because they're given that sort of that wide berth, and they're only sort of ever invigilated if they ever do something starkly, if they get caught for doing something starkly wrong. So, the kind of things that you can get away with being a woman, the benefit of the doubt that is always extended to you, that permits the space in order to orchestrate this the borderline sort of cultural mechanism. And that borderline mechanism has to use, let's say, symbolism. It has to use pictures. It has to use simplified dynamics, essentially, or very simplistic reductions. Usually they're often false reductions. And, usually, this borderline personality disorder, it's very easy to see through them. Usually they don't actually even aim at essentially being invulnerable to criticism. They essentially aim at being invulnerable to being reasoned with. And so because you can't convince them of anything, and because we have a society in which individual liberty is sacrosanct and sanctified well enough to fortify them from, well, I don't agree with you, so I don't have to think about what you're saying, and so as long as you don't reason with them, then they are insulated. Their behavior essentially can continue on, and they can continue to do their strategy of essentially exploiting whatever rhetoric that they're using at the time. They people can understand if they have any sort of insight into narcissism and borderline and things like that, just how surreal their fabrications are and how surreal their manipulation is. And this has to be built on something that sounds plausible. I mean, it's specious. It's basically speciousness. Is what exactly is what it is. It uses speciousness as a veil, effectively, as a vector of exploitation. And as long as whatever they do is specious, is technically specious, so even if it is wrong, but it is validly specious, they can get away with it, essentially. That is almost a good summary of sort of the mode of extraction of borderline. And now, it's hard to maintain a specious ecosystem of symbols and understanding, right? And this is why they often can't even keep their stories straight between themselves, which is also why they like to compartment their stories and divide them amongst different groups of people. So, they will have different spheres and different circles, and they will try not to make them mix, because the things that they fed one circle in order to control and manipulate and have a reading on things and orchestrate things in one sphere is going to be directly dysfunctional if it is mixed with the kind of role that they play in another sphere. And already you can start to see analogies of how identity politics itself falls down, of how it essentially you have all these different spheres and all these different specialized complaints that everyone has against the same targeted scapegoat. But do those complaints coalesce into anything coherent that can be done? No, they do not. They are just endless complaints of distraught, hysterical, table-thumped, demands. And if you try to put them all together, you would literally get absolutely nothing. It's complete. It's just chaotic noise, essentially, because it's fundamentally based on having no integrity and having no responsibility and no accountability. That is all projected onto the scapegoat. And so effectively you become a client, essentially, of your ideology, and you and of whoever is pandering the ideological complaint to you and allowing you to continue in this vassal state of irresponsibility. So, and this is what these neo-Marxists essentially are. They tell these stories, they tell these reductions, they tell these stereotypes, these low-resolution narratives, and then essentially you say, yes, my irresponsibility is actually a form of virtue. And I've actually got a better description of this in terms of how the ideology is effectively converting envy into jealousy. Envy as in something that doesn't belong to you that you want, and jealousy is something that belongs to you that's been stolen or that is threatening, that is under threat of being stolen. and it's much stronger to be jealous. You're actually in a position of at least potential possession, or at least of once possessing it, and it's been taken. So it's a way of essentially focusing on the jealousy dynamic and then conflating that with envy and allowing envy. And envy is actually the source of the imagination that the ideology allows its adherents to enjoy. And so they effectively can imagine all the counterfactual things that were taken from them while having no accountability for actually generating them, except that they must be returned to them. So they can just sort of imagine all these things that deserve to be returned to them. And then you've got a plutocracy that can pander to this narcissistic drivel, and you've got a demoralized, demoralized in the sense of that they don't even have real morality. They don't have an ethical foundation. They just have this image, this group think, sort of. They're like zombies. They literally are zombies, just like the fascists were zombies. It's the same zombie virus, It's the same hysterical, sort of sparkle in their eye and smiling. It's that same, what we call, the stupid liberals, the hysterical chanting and things like that. It's they are, and it's interesting because if they win, it's interesting how they start to hollow out language as well. They literally create a culture that is so brittle and unsustainable that it radically devolves very, very quickly. If they don't keep on finding things to burn and new things to break down and new internal conspiracies, people forget that the Jewish conspiracy was then after they were even winning the war, and all the Jews were locked away. They still complained that the Jewish conspiracy had been internalized, just like white privilege has been internalized. This fucking bullshit, it never fucking ends. Because if they can't sustain the civil war, if they can't sustain the eternal revolution, it has no sense of progress. It has to have an adversary in order to keep in mind the existentialist threat that they have of yet more oppression. It's a fear-driven ideology, and it ends up being an unconscious fear of responsibility. Although I think it's too close to the surface to actually even call it unconscious. I think these people, they do have intellectual bad faith. They are. There's no point in lumping more insults against them. They are just. These people are the reason why we have never been able to progress, essentially, as a people, as a civilization. This is why we've never been able to actually have nice things, and have just methodical progress and development and transformation and better things and better things and better things, because we've had this is the element that has been holding us back. It has not been in the leadership. It has not been in the elites. It is the elites that are sympathetic with this, with these instruments. It's not bad leadership that causes problems. It is actually the character trait in the people themselves, and they find sympathy in ideological constructs which they find to lead them. There's this huge sympathy between the so-called revolutionary mentality of an age and its decadence and its debauchery. And it's just it's just disgusting conceit and tautological self sufficiency. They're not. Listen to Christopher Hitchens talk about how Martin Luther King was actually the real revolutionary, taking flack from both sides, as opposed to the Black Panthers, which at the time he thought were more revolutionary, and then he realized just how reactionary they were. It's a very good clip from Christopher Hitchens. Anyway, I should probably actually link things like this, but anyway.